Hi, my name is Stanislav Costiuc and I am a game designer. Today we will take a look at a game that participated in a Patreon topic vote thanks to the suggestion of our patron 6keys, Okami. I know people usually pronounce it as Okami, however considering that we hear this every time we start the game, Okami. I think it will be only fair to pronounce it the same way. Okami was originally released for PlayStation 2 back in 2006. In 2012, it received an HD remaster for PlayStation 3, and since then that version was ported to many different platforms, including Switch, which is the version used for the footage of this video. And even though you can't go wrong with any of the platforms, as the game is the same everywhere, I do believe that the Switch port is the definitive way to play Okami due to the possibility to use any celestial brush control method that suits you best: traditional, motion, and touch. With all this informational aspect out of the way, let's get to our critique, which will be spoiler-free only until a certain point marked in the video itself, as well as in the chapter names. As with all other videos on the channel, it will be based on my Stasocritic scoring system, the first category of which is design. This part of Stasocritic affects scoring the most as it's got the weight of 4. Video games are interactive experiences, so this section will be focused mostly on things related to gameplay and how well it is built and structured. Usually I use the top-down approach for my design critique. I start talking about the high-level vision, and during that discussion we move towards low-level mechanics. There are several reasons for that. First, it mimics the broad flow of game development, which makes it pretty straightforward to see how different aspects of a game affect one another. But it also mimics the process of understanding a game when playing it. In the beginning, you generally speaking figure out what's it about, and then as you progress you also get a better grasp of how gameplay mechanics actually work. The reason I mention all that is because in this video we will follow a different flow, to mimic that one of Okami, where at the beginning you really don't get what it is about. Okami does teach you all the mechanics, the basic movement, combat, and how to use the celestial brush, which is the game's main feature. But it is difficult to understand their purpose. What are you actually doing? Okami starts with a 20-minute cutscene which you can't skip unless you have finished the game once already. But you're also not able to fast-forward text in that cutscene regardless of which playthrough this is. It is a very long prologue that will tell you what has happened 100 years ago, but in the grand scheme of things I am not sure why it is needed. Many characters fill you in the history during in-game dialogue regardless, and some of the stuff has already been told in an intro that plays just before the main menu. So from the get-go there is a blatant pacing issue. What follows after is a series of long tutorials in very linear environments. And I do mean very. Your pathway from the River of the Heavens to the Cave of Nagi is pretty much one big corridor during which you learn the first 2 brush powers. You then have to backtrack all the way through to get access to Kamiki village. Now you might think you'll get a little bit of exploration there, but you'd be wrong. Even though it is not exactly a corridor, it is still a very linear environment where you also can't reach everything yet due to lack of brush powers. Now, to learn the sun technique and bring light back into the village, you have to go to the sacred deck on top of a mountain. But nothing will happen there unless you take a look at enough villagers turned into stone, and only after will the game decide that you can now learn the new brush power when you reach the deck. And look, there is nothing wrong with the linear environments, but their enjoyment is directly related to knowing their purpose, which you don't at this point in the game. You're just sent to different locations while following instructions with things happening in the story. And while the narrative in the beginning is certainly intriguing enough, there is nothing to justify a structure that is so rigid. When you access the next location, Shinshu Field, you'll first have access only to a part of it which is essentially another corridor. And then you get to Hana Valley and yeah, not that exciting, is it? But when you reach the Guardian Sapling in Hana Valley, which will happen at around the 2-hour mark of playing Okami, and learn the bloom technique, everything finally clicks into place. Okami is a game about rejuvenation. Ironically, that's the name of the very first brush technique you get, which lets you fix broken things, but because you use it only in particular forced tutorial segments, you never get the feeling that it's the purpose of the entire game. After getting bloom though, you can start bringing life back to the world at your own pace. revive dead or hostile trees, call animals by raising dark zones, feed those animals, bloom guardian trees to remove curses from entire maps, find devil gates to get rid of their influence, and so on. After 2 hours of playing, you finally get a purpose, and you can actively see the results of your actions change the world around you. Sure, you can't do absolutely everything yet, some areas or secrets are blocked off with brush powers you won't have for a really long while, there is still a lot of guidance, and honestly most maps that you visit will be more on the linear side. But you're not just simply following instructions anymore, you get agency, and through that agency you can restore a broken world and it feels good. It is very rewarding to see grass going through an area, removing a dark influence, and then getting praise, which is a very clever skin for the traditional XP system. We play as Amaterasu, the sun goddess in wolf form, and gods in Okami get power from people believing in them, which forms a very thematically appropriate core gameplay loop. We help the world and its people, as a result the belief in us gets stronger, and that allows us to become more powerful and help more people. Many gameplay loops are based on personal empowerment, that's what usually makes players feel good, though it is also selfish in a way. But in Okami that empowerment is tied to helping people and the world around you, therefore putting the selfish loop in a selfless light, making it rewarding to try and assist as many people, animals and plants as possible. Now, the pillar of rejuvenation is supported by 2 other more gameplay-focused pillars. One is exploration. To solve a problem you need to go around the world to find it, though of course there are other aspects to exploration too, like finding treasures. The other pillar is combat, which in Okami happens in restricted arenas. You might notice the pillars of exploration and combat don't intersect, as most of the time the world doesn't matter for the combat arena. There are exceptions of course. Boss battles tend to incorporate the world into combat design, and there are some cases where what is inside the arena matters. For example, you can use a torch to send fire towards an ice-based enemy. But most of the time, once you engage with the demon scroll, what's in the surroundings at that moment doesn't really matter. It is a separate gameplay aspect. And what connects all these 3 pillars together is the Celestial Brush, which you use to rejuvenate the world, find more places to explore, and deal with enemies. Together with the core loop, all this forms the foundation of the Okami experience, both in terms of gameplay and narrative. It is a shame though that it takes about 2 hours to get that. If you take a look at achievement statistics, for example on PS4, only 2/3 of the players have learned the bloom technique where it all clicks. Now, of course, statistics of a remaster aren't always representative of how people would play when the game originally came out, and I usually don't use achievement stats for my design critique, but in this particular case I figured it is important to show why timely understanding of what the game is about matters. What makes it somewhat worse is that there is a similar issue of understanding with combat, which is a big part of the game. You also don't really get it at first, this time until about 4 or 5 hours in. When you begin the game, combat is not something that poses any challenge at all. You pretty much have to just button mash and use your brush powers to damage enemies. Sure, the design of demons gets progressively more complex. For example, at some point you start facing enemies that block your attack with a weapon, and you need to overcome that with a slash technique, and then with other enemies you will need to use bloom at opportune moments or other powers. But at the end of the day, it still feels like pretty mindless button mashing, and it doesn't help that you can get good damage and time bonuses by just doing that. Everything changes when you learn about floral finishers, which can happen at around 4, 5 or even 6 hours in, as it really depends on when you speak with the Demon Fang trader in Agata Forest. Knowing about fannings fully recontextualizes the way you think about combat. The engagement comes not from challenge necessarily, but from being attentive in how you deal with enemies. Demon fangs are a special resource that you can buy unique items with, and the best way to get them is to use floral finishers on enemies. When a demon reaches 0 health, they go into slow motion death animation. If you perform a particular brush technique on that enemy, and what that technique would be differs for every demon type, so you have to figure it out first, you'll receive 1 or more fangs. The trick is, if you hit the enemy with a standard attack during their death animation, you can't perform a floral finisher anymore. And if you bring an enemy's health to 0 with a brush power, then it will be sliced up immediately and you won't be able to use a floral finisher either. This single mechanic prevents you from just mindlessly button mashing and makes you much more involved with the process of combat, even though technically speaking it is not more difficult. But that doesn't matter, challenge is just one path to engage in combat, and Okami prefers to have a pretty straightforward base, but with a higher skill ceiling for your potential performance, and that is perfectly fine. At one point you learn that if you set up reflector-type weapons as your secondary items, you can use them to block or counter enemy attacks. And if you do a perfect block or counter, meaning you press the button just before the attack strikes, resulting in a green ornament appearing on the screen, you get a Demon Fang. This also makes you more involved with combat, and it's not too punishing either, as there is another mechanic in place, Godhood. As you attack enemies, you gain this stat, which is essentially protection from one enemy hit, up to 3, one for each Godhood level. So as long as you're active in combat but also not too reckless, missing a perfect counter is not punished. Many games tend to tie perfect parries with the risk-reward situation. Okami doesn't, but in the context of this game, that's not really a problem. As you learn all these intricacies, you really start getting into the flow of combat. Attacking, countering, using correct brush techniques at opportune moments, it all becomes very enjoyable to perform, so again, it is a pity that it takes the game so long to show what combat is really about. And that's not the only big aspect of the game that Okami fails to properly introduce. At one point you start getting into locations that Okami presents as Zelda-like dungeons, to the point that there even is a special map item that you can find in a chest somewhere. Now, the first two dungeons, Tsuto Ruins and Gale Shrine, don't really provide a good impression because of that. They are both very linear, with pretty much only a single option available to you at all times, exploration is very minimal, puzzles are rudimentary, solution to them is always located within the same room as the puzzle. The only positive aspect seems to be the boss battles themselves. Why do you need to care about the location of locked doors if at any given moment there is only one door you can open anyway? Why do you need to know the layout of the dungeon if it will guide you through all its rooms regardless? You get questions like this when you go through the first two dungeons. Everything changes though when you reach the third, which on average would happen at around the 10-hour mark, the Moon Cave. This is when it is made clear that dungeons in Okami are not as much about finding your way through interconnected spaces, but completing a series of varying challenges. It's less of a Zelda-like dungeon and more of a platformer level, sometimes looking literally like one. Every dungeon revolves around particular themes, and has a varying set of obstacles fitting those themes. It may be about ghosts and water-based obstacles, it may be a trap gauntlet, or focused on you becoming incredibly small and having to deal with the consequences of everything else being large around you, but it's never really about exploration, and that's fine. It's just Okami gives the wrong first impression due to the way it gradually reveals the area map, and even has a special map item which is useless, sometimes literally, as some of them you get really close to the end of the respective dungeons. And when you look at even the first two dungeons of Okami from that platformer level perspective, they are actually fine. For example, Gale Shrine is all about wind. That's when you get the Galestorm brush technique, there's a bunch of wind-based obstacles. It's absolutely enjoyable as long as you don't have this expectation of needing to explore a series of interconnected spaces and puzzles. And that's the biggest issue of Okami really, setting up expectations. It's not good at presenting what's it about, and only a dozen hours in, by the end of the first act, will you actually fully understand the game. Though this is where we get to what is probably the best part of Okami. It's not as much a single, large 40-50 hour experience, as much as it is a trilogy of games combined under the guise of a single one. Okami is divided into 3 separate arcs that are connected by a couple common threads, although some little exceptions don't intersect with one another. Every arc is focused on entirely different zones, has a totally separate cast of characters with a new story, handles a different set of themes, a new array of enemies. It really feels like Okami consists of an original game and its 2 sequels. And the first act is the most uneven, which is a shame because it's the first and therefore very important for creating proper impressions. Outside of all the issues I have talked about before, most of which are about failing to explain things rather than poor design, another problem that this arc suffers from is spacing. I mainly refer to a lot of back and forth between zones mandated by the main story. As you can see on the map here, you will have to backtrack a lot. At times it feels like padding, especially when after reaching the Kusa village you need to find the missing canine warriors all across eastern Nippon in zones you've been to several times already. And there are problems with flow too. For example, to enter Sasa Sanctuary, you need to save Jamba's daughter from the Cutter family, but you can deal with the Cutters only at night. You can't get the brush powers to transform day into night until after you're done with the whole Sasa Sanctuary ordeal, thus being forced to wait if you want to make sure you don't spend the night needlessly while trying to reach their house. And sure, in Sasa Sanctuary you get the ability to purchase mermaid coins which allow you to teleport between specific springs and thus help with backtracking, but the feeling of this being padded still remains. Okami has 13 brush techniques in total, with some having sub-techniques, and you get 9 powers within the first act. So with such a large majority of brush moves locked away but pretty much each area still having uses for them, you often get into a situation when you can't do something about exploration or helping people or the world until a later point. On one hand, this does make all the backtracking more bearable, as every time you return to an area you will have more brush powers, so you can potentially do more things you couldn't before. But it doesn't change the poor taste in your mouth you sometimes get from constantly encountering obstacles you can't do anything with, some of which are unsolvable until the second act. And there are a bunch of other little problems that can affect engagement of an already uneven beginning, most of them related to line of sight. Now, it should be noted that as the game originally released for PlayStation 2, of course it is understandable that it can't display absolutely everything and there will be pop-ins. That's not the problem. What is, though, is the prioritization of what appears on screen. Animals are a good example. As part of the overall loop, you feed them to get praise, but there is also a collectible aspect to it. An animal tome exists that shows what type of creatures you have discovered and how many were fed. Well, a lot of them appear on screen only once you're very close. There might not be anyone in front of you and then boom, a couple of huge tigers. How did you not see them before? But what this means is that you can potentially literally run past by animals without knowing that there are some. Like for example in Taka Pass I would often go near a grass patch, and only once I revisited the zone much later in the game for an absolutely optional secondary quest did I see horses in that location, just because this time I ran by a little bit closer. So who knows how many animals, big or small, I might have missed just because the game prioritizes showing some trees or bushes in the distance instead of creatures. With people, the game tries to solve this issue by showing a thought bubble of a person, first a generic one for somebody far away, and then a more concrete bubble when you get closer and the game places the actual NPC on the map. Though this shouldn't be the solution for animals or grass patches or any other gameplay elements, as then your screen will just be full of thought bubbles. As mentioned, the real issue is how the game prioritizes which objects to actually render on screen, as that can conflict with gameplay needs and make exploration feel more random. There is a similar situation with buried treasures. During night, a special yellow light appears in locations where a chest is buried, and that feedback also tends to pop up only when you're fairly close. Now, theoretically, if you're attentive enough, you can find buried treasure even when it's day, thanks to the ring that is on top of treasure chests, and it works well enough. But not all chests have that ring, so it might not look like there's anything buried there. There are places where during the day you can't possibly know there's a buried treasure, and during the night you have to be close enough to see the light coming out of the ground. This can make the process of finding Okami's main collectibles, stray beads, more cumbersome than it should be. Though to be fair, even if the issue of chest light distance would have been fixed, collecting all stray beads without a guide is not that straightforward regardless. What the game does well is categorize clearly how many beads you still have to find in any given location, and that's great. The problem is, a hefty number of them have really unclear conditions and you have no real way of knowing what they will be. For example, a couple beads from Shinshu Field, one of the first zones you visit in the game, can't be received until you're partially through the third act, in my case more than 30 hours in. Some beads require you to return to zones you thought were cleared out already, or have no reasons to return to, or do actions that would seem illogical. In one part of the game there is a very tall catcall tower. The zone has 3 beads, and to get the third one you need to climb the tower from the bottom to the top a second time. This doesn't come to your mind when you're searching for beads in the area, as you can just teleport to the top, and there are no hints for that either. What is justifiably more well hidden by being placed in locations you wouldn't normally think to come back to are the Devil Gates trials. It is essentially endgame content, each consisting of 10 Devil Gate fights you have to complete one after another, with a lot of enemies, all of which have very high health. And while the amount of health is reasonable with the weapons you have at the end of the game, if you do some trials in the middle like I tried, you'll find them pretty boring, as the enemies will just feel too spongy. Okami's fight system simply doesn't work well with a big discrepancy between the damage you can inflict and health enemies have, as most of them don't know enough moves to keep prolonged fights interesting. But when you do these trials close to the end of the game, they are perfectly enjoyable and keep the best aspects of Okami combat intact, though it would still be good if there had been some sort of hints leading to these trials. It is interesting that Okami features a fortune teller, Madame Fawn, and in this type of games, fortune tellers are usually used to direct you towards secondary content you have missed in exchange for money. In Okami though, Madame Fawn tells only about next steps you have to take in the main story, and that's it. So you don't really have a reason to visit her ever, as the game keeps it very clear at any moment in time what you have to do anyway. But probably the most often met little frustration is the inconsistency of the brush itself, your main mechanic with which you do pretty much everything. Not always, but often enough to notice it doesn't work as you expect and you don't know why. You can draw a circle around a plant to use bloom on it, but it won't, it will just add grass behind the plant. When you need to draw an infinity sign for Inferno, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I have never met issues with drawing 2 straight lines for Veil of Mist, but drawing 3 straight lines for the Cyclone ability doesn't always register. But most of the time I have no idea what am I doing wrong, and the best way to showcase the issue is through a side quest where you need to draw shapes that the little girl thinks up in her head on a kimono. The first one is a star which you need to draw with one movement. I have drawn many fine stars. None of them worked for the quest. The one that did? It was the worst star I drew, which I was sure wouldn't be accepted at all. But it somehow met the internal criteria of having all the right lines and angles. I just don't know. At times brush doesn't work as one would expect and you just have to accept that. In some cases you can adapt to the situation, like for example if you need to draw a cherry bomb as a floral finisher, you can move the camera up to draw the shape on the shadow of the dying enemy and this way make sure that the bomb doesn't appear where you don't want to. But sometimes you just have to live with the brush's inconsistent effects, most of which aren't too bothersome, especially on Switch where it's easy to repeat the motions, but they're there. All of this may sound like nitpicking because in the grand scheme of things those issues don't affect enjoyment negatively that much. But my point is that in the first arc, which already has big issues with pacing and explaining concepts, these and other little problems feel more noticeable. They don't that much in the second arc, which is an absolute blast and I mean it. Remember how I've said that Okami is like a game and its 2 sequels in one package? And you know how in many franchises it happens that the first game is a good but ultimately hit and miss experience that tries to find its footing, while the sequel, now that everything was defined, just goes all out and is absolutely fantastic? Well, that is exactly the case with the second act of Okami. It is really the game at its best. The pacing is great, and yes, while there is some mandated by the story backtracking, including the required short trip all the way back to Sasa Sanctuary from the first region, it is not as prevalent and never feels like padding. Plus, by the time you need to go to Sasa Sanctuary, you can get a second way to teleport across the world in addition to Mermaid Springs, so that part becomes a very straightforward affair. As you already have a lot of powers when you arrive to second act zones, you can instantly start discovering a lot of secrets, help a big number of people, and revive a considerable part of the world without having to wait for a new brush or purchasing a new ability. Therefore, in this act you instantly get full engaged with Okami's pillars, and it is far easier to track places where you do need to wait for something new. There are more explorable areas that are packed with things to do and discover, and zones in this section find a good balance between being corridorish and fully open. And even the latter ones play with buildings or elevation to make sure you pass by certain places pretty close, and that helps with the situations where gameplay elements pop in only at a certain distance. While half of the enemies are essentially a reskin of demons from the first act, the new ones are very interesting and require you to pay more attention to your attacks and brush techniques. And all dungeons are extremely memorable here. Some of the ones I have mentioned already are from this act: the Sunken Ship, Imperial Palace, Oni Island. And there are so many side quests, not to the point that you feel overwhelmed or anything, but you just keep finding things to do and people to help. From racing the postman and getting back stolen items from the thief, to helping removing dark influence from trees, getting a bunch of optional brush upgrades through assisting people or finding secret springs, to fishing. Yes, fishing is introduced in the first act, but it really flourishes in the second one, with 2 whole locations where you can do the activity and a lot of fish to catch. And it's really enjoyable too, the minigame is great. The rules are very simple and straightforward. You draw a line from the rod to a fish, you push the stick in the direction opposite to the fish's movement until it's close enough for you to yank it out and use power slash to catch it. The amount of power slashes required, as well as the fish's behavior and what is the green zone in which the fisherman doesn't exert themselves too much, depends on the rarity and size of the fish. It's a really enjoyable way to spend your time, and even though you don't use fish for anything other than selling it, it is still a very neat activity. I would do it just for the sake of it rather than money. I have to clarify that the first act isn't bad. Regardless of all the issues I've listed, at the end of the day it is still good, but the second one is so great, and it's just so detailed and full of things to do while not being overstuffed. About 18-20 hours out of your 40-hour playthrough will be spent here, at least based on my experience playing Okami several times. Which leaves us with the logical question, what about the third act? Well, the analogy of Okami being a trilogy actually works here as well. You know how in many franchises, for one reason or another, many third installments feel rushed or unfinished or otherwise somewhat of a letdown? That is precisely the case of Okami and its third act in Kamui. Again, it's not bad, but you can feel how a lot about its development was to just wrap things up. There are far less main and side quests and things to do, you don't really have to use a lot of your brush powers during this part of the adventure, pacing again gets a little bit iffy with more back and forth between zones and less fast travel points, it has only one proper dungeon, though it is a really good one, and a lot of recycled enemies. Don't get me wrong, Act 2 also has recycled demons from the first part with a different model, and there is nothing wrong with that. That's how we get games done, really. But Act 3 recycles the set of 5 basic enemies, originally imps, 2 times. Not to mention most other monsters are a reskin of things you have seen before as well, though to be fair they do have some little changes for variation. And this is the moment where this video will stop being spoiler free, so if you want to avoid them, feel free to jump at the very last section to see the final conclusions and decide if you want to check out Okami or not. If you don't care about that or have played Okami already, feel free to keep watching. So, since we have talked about Act 3 and recycling, I have to mention that a significant part of it happens in the past. 100 years ago, during the times of the legend you've been told at the beginning of the game. Naturally in the same but slightly altered areas. Narratively speaking, that's a very cool sequence, but gameplay-wise, there is not a lot to speak about. Each act has 2 big boss fights, and one of the 2 bosses in the third act is a direct copy of the Orochi battle from the first act. There is literally nothing new, even though the monster is supposed to be stronger and more in his prime at this time. What's worse is that soon enough you'll have to battle Orochi for the third time, as before reaching the final boss of the entire game you have to go through sort of a boss rush. And while in the case of all other bosses there's a really cool contrast in how powerful you feel because they become really easy in comparison to when you first fought them, Orochi still takes a lot of time because his design is actually not that great. In the beginning you need to make 3 heads drunk by pouring sake into their mouths while they roar. Here, each head has different combat moves depending on the element they represent, which is actually really neat. But that's the shortest part of the battle. After you make 3 heads drunk, you have to destroy the bell on Orochi's back, and then you need to defeat all the 8 heads one by one. By doing the same thing over and over again and defending against the absolutely same moves regardless of the head. It is a time-consuming process, and while the first time you battle Orochi it still feels intense, the second or third time it just becomes boring. Generally speaking though, Okami's bosses are good. Fight with Ninetales is great, it is intense, fast-paced, he has got brush powers like you do, and is just generally speaking very enjoyable. Fights with Lechko and Nechko are fantastic as well, and they've got a great narrative surrounding them. The smaller bosses like Spider Queen, Crimson Helm and Blight are fine too, though not as memorable, but they're also lesser beings in the context of the story. But the best boss in the game is hands down Yami, the ruler of darkness you fight at the very end. And it's a pleasant surprise, because often when the ending development is rushed, that affects the final boss the most. Not in Okami. In Okami the final boss is the culmination of both combat gameplay as well as the narrative aspect which we'll discuss later. All your brush powers are stolen from you, and you have to take them back one by one, by dealing with an onslaught of many varying attacks and forms of Yami, and then having to use all the brush powers that you're getting back. And then when you think you have defeated him, he just hammers you down again, but you are reinvigorated back to your prime form you have had before the events of the game, with people you have met all over the land beginning to really believing in you, bringing a lot of strength which culminates in an amazingly epic moment that Look, I will just let you watch and listen to this. Okami can be seen as a bit of a weird experience. It starts out unevenly, then gets really incredible for most of the playtime, before starting to lose steam again, but then the whole game ends with a high note, both in terms of gameplay and story. And I want to make one thing clear. While the first 2 hours of the game are lackluster, most of the issues from the first act come not from flawed design specifically, but failure to set up expectations and provide explanations. Yes, there are a bunch of smaller issues, some of which I have mentioned in this video, some of which I haven't, but at the end of the day, if you open all the possible scores for the design category, Okami deserves an 8. It is a strong game design-wise. It has a very compelling core that it builds its experience around, has a lot of great quests, minigames, boss battles, platformer dungeonish levels, and it really gets you in the zone. And I will explain what I mean. Even though I have mentioned issues with line of sight preventing me from seeing animals to feed, the core problem of that particular argument is that I just want to make sure I feed all animals. That action is really simple, you just go to the menu and select a food type. You don't really get a lot of praise from that, but it is something you feel compelled to do. And that is the biggest strength of Okami. It is so compelling that even actions that may feel rudimentary and not useful gameplay-wise are enjoyable to do. And not a single flaw of this game will be able to change that. Now, it's time to talk about context. This category is focused on everything that provides context to players' actions, story, characters, motivation, themes, and so on. It's got a weight of 1 because this layer enhances the experience but doesn't necessarily define it. If you've skipped the part in the design section where I provide a spoiler warning, well, this is your last chance. Past this part, only the final conclusions at the end will be spoiler-free. Okami is deeply steeped in Japanese culture. It is a mishmash of Japanese mythology, history, fairy tales, set in what is essentially a mythical version of Japan, called Nippon in the English version. But it's not what you'd call a faithful recreation. The purpose of Okami is not to teach about all those things, but play with them and make everything its own, governed by Okami's internal logic. What this means is that if you're a part of that culture or just know it, you will see and understand a lot of references. But if you don't know anything, that won't prevent you from enjoying the game. It might even push to start researching everything Okami takes inspiration from, even the name of the game itself. Okami means wolf, but the kanji characters for that also mean great deity. This is why Amaterasu, the sun goddess who plays as, is represented as a wolf. And this aspect is developed further. All the other gods we're collecting brush parts from are animals of the East Asian zodiac, including the cat who didn't get a place among the 12 known to us. This is an example of how Okami builds on top of each other all its decisions related to folklore representation. In the mythology, Amaterasu shuts herself in a cave, thus plunging the world into darkness as there is no sun anymore. Eventually she re-emerges and the sun gets back. In the game, we start in a small cave at the statue dedicated to the previous reincarnation of Amaterasu that died 100 years ago, with the world being in darkness until we eventually bring the sun back after emerging from the cave. In the myths, Susanoo was Amaterasu's brother. In the game, he is not, but by the end of his arc he considers himself and Amaterasu to be brothers-in-arms. Or sisters-in-arms? I guess it depends on whose perspective you look at. Regardless, you can see how Okami cleverly plays with mythology to create its story. But again, you don't need to know anything about Japanese mythology to understand what is happening, because Okami has a perfectly functioning standalone story that doesn't feel like it's just a collection of myths. There are so many different character arcs connected to a variety of themes the game explores. The overarching theme across the whole game is destiny, and this theme is closely connected to the three main characters. As a Materasu, our relationship to destiny is pretty straightforward. We need to get all our powers back to be able to fulfill the main goal of cleansing the world from darkness. Our constant companion across the game, the Punkle Isun, refuses to meet his destiny. He was trained to become a celestial envoy, an artist who through their drawings would spread the knowledge about deeds of the gods to people of Nippon, strengthening their beliefs, which by extension would make the gods stronger. Yet Isun ran away from his village, refusing to meet that destiny and tagging along Amaterasu, whom he calls Ami, just to learn all the brush god powers for himself. Of course, the events of the game would lead to him going towards and accepting his destiny. And the third character is Waka, who wants to change his destiny as the last survivor of the Celestials that have landed on Earth trying to escape the demons who attacked their tribe on the moon, but unwittingly brought all the monsters with them. He wants to escape the fate of being constantly hunted by the dark beings and get rid of the damage he has done. Another connection between him and destiny is the fact that he is somewhat of a prophet and can predict the future, though in manners that can feel strange. Okami is divided into three distinct acts. Each has a focus on a particular theme, as well as plot and character arcs connected to that theme. The first act is all about fear. We start in Kamiki village that in the past has lived in constant fear of the eight-headed demon Orochi, who every year demanded sacrifice. And now that Orochi has been reborn, fear gets back to the village as well. Every prominent character in this arc has to deal with some form of fear. Susanoo, the descendant of the great hero Nagi, is a very insecure person who, with our help, eventually finds his courage to face the evil Orochi he unwittingly helped to release back in the world again. And there is depth to the character beyond that aspect of fear. All his life, Susanoo lived in the shadow of his ancestor Nagi, tired of constantly hearing how he should live up to him while creating a facade of being the greatest swordsman of all time. And even though you wouldn't agree with his actions, you can understand him. But in the end, he does become a hero, overcoming his fear and getting to the moon cave to save the day. All the time, whenever Susanoo will do his heroics, it'll be with the help of our brush, but at the very end of the fight with Orochi, he makes it clear that he understood he was being assisted and needs to prove himself by doing that last strike alone. And there are many other characters who have this aspect of fear that they have to overcome. Kokari is a boy who is very unconfident in himself, but when his dog gets in danger, he is forced to find his courage. Princess Fuse, the priestess of the Gale Shrine, afraid of the demons that have killed her husband and cursed Kusa village, becomes determined to find the 8 canine warriors. And one of those warriors is Hayabusa, who is revealed to not actually be the real dog that died before the events of the game, but somebody who was asked to take their place and protect the boy Mushi from an arrow that was supposed to strike him. At times the dialogue can be too on the nose, but all these characters are still great, and the moments we see are no less touching. Act 2 takes a much darker turn and is focused mainly on the theme of sacrifice. What are people willing to give up for the greater good? Their life? Many do. Queen Himiko does so to find the elusive Oni Island from which demons attack the area, which is followed by a very dramatic moment when we race against time to make that sacrifice matter, as the island will disappear on sundown. The king of the Dragonians turns himself into the water dragon to protect his people, eventually dying due to his wounds, and his wife Otohime is ready to make the same sacrifice to make sure the demons of Oni Island are destroyed. What is wonderful about Okami is that a lot of the time when you meet different characters you think of them one way, but that changes as you learn more about them and they go through their arcs. Act 3 is all about despair. The day of darkness is about to come, a blizzard is going to freeze and destroy everything in Kamui, and in this despair, what are people willing to do? Do they break the rules to try and help their people like Oki? Do they hide and wallow in self-pity like Wally? And all these characters go through some sort of change, like Oki, who even with his noble desires is too selfish to understand what he's really doing until he learns what it actually means to help others. In fact, so many characters go through change, be it little or big. Of course, the most prominent characters like Susanoo have the biggest arcs, but even people who are related only to side missions go through a process of transformation, like Hayazo the Thief, for example, who through our intervention decides to become a detective. Okami is a rich fabric of many different themes, characters going through their arcs, and all that gets to its culmination in a scene at the end that literally gives you chills. Yami takes all powers away from Amaterasu, but Isun, finally accepting his destiny, spreads all his drawings around so the belief of people in Amaterasu would bring her power back and help defeat the ruler of darkness once and for all. All that said, the contextual aspect of the game is not without its issues. One of them is pacing. When you go through what feels like filler that I described in the design section, it doesn't only feel like a gameplay filler, but a narrative one as well. But I will not go through that in detail because I will essentially be repeating the same points I have before. Then there is a part of Isun's personality that is very grating in terms of how exactly it is represented, and you'll face that very often. Now, I gotta say, Okami has a great cast of heroic characters and it actually defies expectations in how it represents them. What I mean is, the male characters usually think highly of themselves because that is the role assigned to them by society, but they're actually buffoons that are full of doubts and insecurities, and their arcs revolve around accepting their flaws and becoming heroes through their actions rather than what people stereotypically view them to be. It is a very similar case with the woman cast in this game. It is full of great heroic characters, and Okami examines how strength can come in many forms by taking traditional passive feminine tropes and subverting them to give active agency that shows how different women are all heroes in their own way. Even somebody who can be depicted as a damsel in distress, Kushi is a strong and believable character. She is not a warrior, she brews sake, which by the way at times requires her to go through half of the land with a really huge bucket of water. And when she is selected to become a sacrifice for Orochi, Kushi is not stolen or otherwise robbed of her agency. She accepts that fate to fight with Orochi the only way she knows how, with sake. Princess Fuse, Kunhimiko, Orohime, and many other characters are like that. They turn around the different stereotypes these types of characters are often depicted with to form strong, heroic personalities. And that's fantastic. There are, however, two big issues related to that, one of which I will talk about later, and one I will discuss now, which brings us back to Isun. There is a part of his personality that regularly diminishes the traits of women characters in this game to breasts and pretty faces. That's all he cares about and really is a big pervert. I do think that in principle having a character who is easily swayed by a woman's beauty is fine, conceptually, but the way Isun does that can come off as really creepy and it draws attention away from the stronger character traits these women have. So if you open all scores for context, by the way feel free to pause if you want to read them all, Okami gets a 9. It has a fantastic cast of characters, a rich and endearing story, so many wonderful themes are tackled in a way that gives you chills, but the pacing of it all can be a really big problem, plus Isun really hurts the perception of women in this game. Now that we've talked about this category, let's move on to aesthetics. This is another category with a weight of 1 because it is also about something that doesn't define the experience but does enhance it through visual style, music, sounds, and everything else that brings aesthetic pleasure. Okami has got a lot of amazing artwork based on the Ukiyo-e Japanese art style. It is used for introduction of every enemy type as well as many chapter-ending cutscenes, and these drawings really add to this mythical feeling of the entire experience, like you're reliving a legend. Now, the style of gameplay art itself more closely resembles watercolor art than the Japanese woodblock prints, which fits really well with the whole celestial brush mechanic. And there is a very interesting effect caused by the usage of these two art styles. Outside of all the themes I have discussed in the previous category, Okami revolves a lot around the notion of living up to the myths and stories of the past. In the first act, the legend of defeating Orochi 100 years ago is a big cultural touchstone, and now that he is back there is a lot of pressure to live up to that history, to become the same heroes. And this animated art style makes everything feel less heroic in a way, because reality is not like that. People become great through their actions. And then those actions are made eternal in larger-than-life stories and paintings, which also fits the whole notion that Okami is a story told to you by an old Isun who actually drew all that Ukiyo-e art. It's an interesting dynamic, and the game certainly looks great. There is tons of attention to detail, animation has a lot of character to it, and the surroundings look beautiful. I do wish the remastered versions of the game would do something with the draw distance, because it can be jarring to see a huge cherry blossom guardian tree pop out of nowhere. But in terms of visual presentation, there are some issues bigger than the technical limitations of 2006. I want to talk about the design of female characters in this game. Now, don't get me wrong, as we have discussed before, Okami has a great cast of characters with many wonderful visual designs. I appreciate that you can even find promotion of body positivity as well. But just like Isun's one-tapped mannerisms in his interaction with women, the design of the main female cast is very one-typed, as you can see in the footage before you. It doesn't help that one of the very first things you see in Okami is a butt cleavage on a dress of a spirit who is losing her power. And what happens when she regains power? She loses more clothes for some reason. Now, if you have played Okami, you might be thinking that I'm about to criticize the hell out of Rao, who is the most over-sexualized character in the entire game. Her main defining characteristic is that she's a, quote, busty babe. Every cutscene reminds us that she has big breasts, which attract not only Isun but Amaterasu as well, and her musical theme is full of moans. That said, and I don't know if it's by a happy accident or that was the intention, I actually think it works. It's all still cringy as hell, and I facepalmed more than once in our interactions with Rao, but if you look past her appearance, she acts very suspiciously on a regular basis, and yet our heroes keep helping her out because... breasts. And then it turns out the real Rao was dead all this time, fitting with the theme of sacrifice going through the second act, and her place was taken by an evil fox demon, and we all know why. Because that way people focusing only on breasts, and not the kind and caring personality everyone in Seiyan knows the real Rao had, can be played for fools. There is a lesson and a point to that. However, it is still a fair question if over-sexualization is actually justified, because regardless of the lesson, it does keep perpetuating unhealthy representation, and the lesson itself might be lost among other problems I mentioned before. So since we got on topic of characters, I want to discuss dialogue sounds a bit. The game uses gibberish for all its conversations, which is absolutely fine. There are many different voices that fit the characters' personalities, and some additional sounds as well. However, I'm still glad that most of the dialogues can be fast-forwarded, because there is not enough variety in voice loops which can make the dialogue sound very repetitive very quickly, especially when somebody talks for a while. Where you won't find absolutely any issues at all is in Okami's music. Not only is it fantastic, the game uses leitmotifs to build upon themes and character arcs and enhance the experience. The first time we hear Amaterasu's theme sounds like this. It is just a single phrase, so it might be easily missed, but it's the first seed of that tune in our heads. We hear a part of the same leitmotif during the music that plays when we revive the garden tree. And then, after rejuvenating plenty parts of the world and getting back to Kamiki village, we hear Amaterasu's theme properly for the first time, as people are happy, unknowingly celebrating our success. The formation of this theme from humble beginnings to something concrete mirrors the aspect of us getting stronger as we gain praise for helping out people in this land. And you will hear Amaterasu's theme woven in or openly used in quite a lot of music throughout the game. One example I like a lot is the race music. But the very first time we ever hear Amaterasu's theme in its full epic glory is only at the very end, where during the battle with the ruler of darkness she regains her full power she has had 100 years ago, thanks to Isun spreading the knowledge that it was she who was helping everyone out all this time. This is not only a great tune fitting the mood of the situation. One of the reasons it hits particularly deep is because you've been hearing it in different variations ever since the very beginning. And as I have mentioned the moment when Isun helps Amaterasu, the music in that scene gives literal chills as well. It is very emotional. By the way, this particular tune is called Reset, and it's an instrumental version of the song that was played in the credits of the original PlayStation 2 version of Okami, but not in any of the re-releases. The full song with lyrics is also great, but I'm not gonna put it in my video to avoid potential issues, as my guess is that it was removed due to licensing problems. And look, I could stop talking about music now because I have made all my points clear. How amazing it is, how themes perfectly fit the situations they play at, and how Okami smartly evolves leitmotifs throughout your adventure and different character arcs. But I love Okami's music so much, I'm just gonna place parts of some of my favorite tracks here for you to listen. So there is Susanoo's theme, that one is very catchy. Kush's Ride is played at plenty of moments that involve racing against time, and it's a fantastic song that really makes you feel the tension. And ambience is fantastic too, like the track that plays in Shinshu Field. Or the one from Ryoshima Coast. and that is this piece that plays in many touching moments. And I'm very far from done, but I have to stop at some point because I can't just keep putting Okami music in this video. Or can I? Just kidding. Let's wrap up the aesthetic segment and open up the potential scores for this category. Out of all of these, Okami gets a 9. The visual style is great, the artwork is fantastic, music, well, I don't think I have to say anything more about that. But technical pop-in issues, which are forgivable in the original but less so in the remaster, repetitive voices, and most importantly some questionable visual design decisions are all too prominent and prevent the game from getting the full score. And now, let's talk about Cohesion. The scores in this category have a weight of 2, and it's all about how well all the different elements of a game work together to create a wholesome, holistic experience. Okami is not a perfect game. It's got a number of design issues, problems introducing different concepts, at times poor pacing, questionable representation, among some other things. But when it comes to creating a holistic experience, the game excels. Starting from the foundation, the gameplay and the narrative revolve around the same thing. The whole point of playing the game is to go around the world, rejuvenate it by bringing life back, getting rid of darkness and helping people, all while becoming more powerful as belief in you strengthens, and the broad outline of the plot essentially follows suit. Now I know this argument may sound weird because it just makes so much sense, gameplay and story being about the same thing, but it's not something that happens incredibly often. A lot of times mechanics and plot do not mesh well together, sometimes contradicting each other, which is a big reason why this category exists in the first place. The whole game is essentially a legend being told to us, and the chosen art style for gameplay and different cutscenes represent that fact. Isun, who is actually the person telling the story, is an artist, so naturally he would retell the events through art, which is also connected to the profession of the celestial envoy in the story, Punkles who through their paintings tell people about gods. It all goes full circle. The music, as we have discussed before, goes hand in hand with character progression and evolution of the world, and there are additional elements present to make sure gameplay needs make sense. For example, you often have to search for treasure in this game, mostly as a side activity. This doesn't really fit with the whole point of getting rid of darkness in the world, but Okami makes sure to add treasure hunting as a character trait to Isun. After running away from the village and his destiny to become a celestial envoy, he is focused on selfish enrichment. One of my favorite moments of emotions created through gameplay in Okami is during the first phase of the Lechku and Nechku boss fight, when we're assisted by Shiranui, our previous incarnation from 100 years ago that was much more powerful than we are. All this game we have known that we didn't recover our past strength yet, but this team battle really puts everything in perspective, where Shiranui literally wrecks our enemy through her attacks and brush powers, and we mostly just tag along, really not able to cause much damage in comparison. This moment creates anticipation, the expectations of which are fully met when, thanks to people starting to believe in Amaterasu, she gets her previous form back. And we go toe-to-toe with the most powerful dark being there is in an epic moment I have shown once already. It may seem weird that this powerful dark being is a fish, because, well, it is weird. But then again, we are a wolf, and Yami does have markings similar to ours, so it is all contained within the game's logic, especially considering that by being fully unwrapped in mechanical contraptions, he is a direct antithesis to nature represented by us. And look, there are some hiccups in Okami. For example, when you infiltrate the moon cave, you put on an imp mask, on which you can draw whatever you want by the way, so they would assume we're one of them. And yet sometimes in the dungeon there are still random demons attacking us, which feels weird considering everybody else is friendly. But all in all, these are minor forgivable questions that don't prevent Okami from getting a 10 in this category. Not only the game successfully sets up and develops its own internal logic thanks to which everything makes sense, there is enough direct interplay between gameplay, story and aesthetics that enhances our experience even further. Let's go to our final category, emotions. This is absolutely the most objective category of Stasocritic, as it is all about personal feelings. And yet it has the second biggest weight, 3, because honestly these feelings matter a lot. You can love an incredibly flawed experience or hate a very polished one. When I played Okami for the first time, at the beginning I wasn't exactly impressed. I never had a PlayStation 2 during my childhood, so I couldn't play the game when it was released, even though I heard a lot about it and how many people absolutely love it. And when I finally got the HD version for Switch, I was getting ready for a blast. Which I didn't get at first, but you know why, I have explained all the reasons in the design section. I thought it was alright, figured that maybe I overhyped myself throughout the year, so I have to make sure to keep my expectations lower. I was very intrigued by the world and story, which were the elements that kept pushing me to play it further. And then the game slowly started to grow on me, until at one point it just hooked me to the point that I wouldn't even exit it. I would just put my Switch to sleep, and then whenever I would get the chance, I would quickly unpause the game to play as much as I can before getting back to other business. By the way, this aspect of Switch's mobility is great. While Okami has a generous amount of saving mirrors, with a portable mode I could be very flexible in my session time, but I digress. If I'm to summarize what Okami did, all I can say is that it hit me in the feels, repeatedly. And I have to admit that sometimes the game is as subtle as a sledgehammer with its dialogue, but that doesn't detract from its charm not one bit. I was happy when Susan overcame his fear to face Orochi, I was heartbroken when Queen Himiko revealed she let Ninetales kill her on purpose, as that was the only way to find Oni Island, and that moment near the end when Isan spreads images of Amaterasu still makes chills go through my body because it is just so invigorating and brings hope for a brighter future. Though I never 100%ed Okami in the full sense of that word. I collected all the beads, with the help of a guide of course because some are really obscure, but I never fully completed the animal, fish and treasure tomes. Okami is still a very enjoyable experience despite the slow start, the music is fantastic and I keep listening to it regularly, and there are so many different emotional moments that stay in my memories that in this category I can't give Okami anything less than a 10. It is among my favorites for sure. And yeah, this video has been quite long, so let's sum everything up, shall we? When all scores and weights are taken into account, the final Stasocritic rating for Okami is 90. It is an absolutely fantastic experience. And look, my scoring system is not something absolutely objective. I attempt to properly argument everything, but at the end of the day, Stasocritic is just something for fun, a representation of my opinions within a number. The meat is still all the points that I make within the video itself, and Okami may drive you away in first impressions. It's not a hey, you need to play for 15 hours to start enjoying it type of game, but it does take a while for it to explain everything before you can really dig into it. Though the first bits of real enjoyment will start appearing relatively early, about 2 hours in, or even before that if you are really intrigued by the story from the get-go. So you might start enjoying Okami later or earlier depending on your tastes. That's a definite problem, this is why the final score is not higher. But let me be absolutely clear, after that initial period of uncertainness will disappear, you're in for an amazing ride. I would recommend this game to absolutely everybody, making sure to mention that caveat that it does have a slower start, but do not let that deter you from enjoying this experience. Thank you all for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, like and comment your thoughts on Okami. A special thank you goes to my patrons. It took about 100 hours of my free time to make this video, so their support is greatly appreciated. If you like what I am doing and want to influence the future of the channel by suggesting and voting for future video topics, please consider supporting my campaign at patreon.com/parlance. Thank you very much.